Chapter 10. Two Speeches. As the jester capered away, King Darrow rose from his seat on the dais. The feasters' uproar died down, and the king called down the center table to Aidan. "What think you of my jester's pigeon pie, young Errolson?" "Your Majesty, I think your jester uses the freshest meat of any chef I know." The great hall erupted again with laughter. The king himself, laughing, remained standing. When the room was quiet enough, he began his speech. "Dear countrymen, New Pythian friends, we are gathered at Tambluff Castle on an important day in Cornwall's short history. Today we join with Perth to say that we are no longer enemies, but friends and partners. Together we will build a better future." All applauded. Darrow looked at the Pythian delegation on his left and right. "Pythians, look around you. You sit among the 24 noblemen of Cornwall. They all have raised their hands in battle against Perth. Today they extend their hands in friendship." Throughout the great hall, the Cornwallers applauded, nodding and smiling in the Pythians' direction. The Perthans, on the other hand, looked as if they might collapse from boredom. They hardly bothered to acknowledge the king's welcome. Darrow continued addressing the Perthans. "True, our two nations have not always seen eye to eye, but even when we faced you in battle, Cornwallers have always held the Empire of Perth in the highest esteem." "Hear, hear!" said Lord Cleland, raising his goblet in salute. Lord Radnor, who sat next to a member of the Perthan delegation, patted his neighbor on the back. The Perthan shot him a dirty look and turned his back to him. At the far end of the great hall, Errol snorted. A scowl began to form on his face. "Cornwall is still a young nation," continued the king, "a nation of explorers, of pioneers, of settlers. When we shaped a nation out of the vast wilderness, we did it alone. We had no other choice." Swept up in the spirit of things, Lord Ethelbert raised his goblet in a toast. "To self-reliance!" Lord Halberd and Lord Cleland fixed Ethelbert with a withering glare of disapproval. Confused and embarrassed, Ethelbert withdrew his toast. King Darrow, ignoring the interruption, continued his speech. "But we cannot remain a nation of explorers and pioneers forever. The time has come for Cornwall to settle down, to grow up, to take our place among the civilized nations of the world." Now Lord Halberd raised his goblet and, looking in Lord Ethelbert's direction, made a toast of his own. "To the partnership of nations." Sensing that this, and not self-reliance, was the theme of Darrow's speech, the 24 and their sons joined the toast. "Hear, hear! To partnership! Hear!" Darrow picked up where he left off. "Cornwall has been like an old alligator, slow to move, set in its wild ways, secure in its own thick skin, and in its isolation from the rest of the world. But the river of human history continues to flow. We must wade out into its current and not remain, like the alligator, mired in a stagnant swamp." Aidan didn't like the direction this speech had taken. Darrow, keeper of alligators, was the one who had established the alligator as Cornwall's national symbol. And now the alligator had become his symbol for what is wrong with Cornwall. Aidan thought of Samson in his cage and wished he had left the poor beast alone. "The friendship and alliance we celebrate tonight marks the beginning of a new era for Cornwall. No longer shall Cornwall be a hidebound old alligator alone in a swampy backwater. We shall be a full participant in the larger community of nations, a community that acknowledges the Persian Empire as its leader. He bowed to the Persian delegation as he said this. Then he threw both arms outward in a comprehensive gesture and boomed, "Behold, the new Corinwald!" The hall shook with the cheers and applause of the 24 and their sons, but Errol was not cheering. With a stern look, he made sure his sons didn't join in either. He sat as silent as a stone, his brow furrowed by a look of sadness and loss. He spoke to himself. Alas for Cornwall! Darrow signaled for silence. The applause gradually subsided. When the audience was quiet, he spoke again. "Before we hear from our honored guests, I want to make a presentation." He motioned to his right, and a servant boy entered the great hall from the courtyard, leading a mule by the bridle. The mule was pulling a long, low wagon covered with a drape of blue silk, richly embroidered with golden boars. Darrow turned to the Perthans. "I have a gift for Emperor Merdad. It's a bit of a living sculpture that I conceived of myself. It serves as a symbol of the new Cornwall. I call it the Wilderness Improved, or Samson Gilded." With a theatrical flourish, Darrow snatched away the drape to reveal a golden cage. Inside the cage was a huge golden statue of an alligator. Only it wasn't a statue. It was Samson, Aiden's alligator, and he was covered from snout to tail tip with gold paint. Darrow had envisioned his living sculpture as a great golden alligator with snapping jaws and flashing eyes, roaring impressively at the assembled onlookers. It was to be a magnificent spectacle, an image of the swamp's primeval energy harnessed and improved by human art and industry. But things were not going according to Darrow's plan. The artist who painted Samson had drugged him, feeding him chunks of meat soaked in a sleeping potion. They had no choice, really. They couldn't possibly paint an 18-foot alligator that was fully alert and functioning. But the effect of the potion were just wearing off when Samson was wheeled into the great hall. The poor alligator was in a stupor. His head swung listlessly from side to side. His tongue lolled out of a half-open mouth. His cloudy eyes were empty of the fiery rage that had so terrified the gatekeeper and the butcher only hours before. Once a worthy adversary for all 5 of Errol's sons and 10 field hands. Now Samson was a pitiable sight. Aiden felt ashamed for having played a part in this ugly spectacle. A shocked gasp went up from the assembly, followed by a brief, confused silence. Then a quick-thinking flatterer among the 24 started clapping. The sound of one man's clapping quickly became a smattering of applause, and soon the great hall shook again with the approval of the Cornwalders. They managed to convince themselves that the gilded alligator was a clever and artistic representation of the new Cornwall, not merely a petty king's embarrassing effort to impress the Emperor of Perth. King Darrow basked in the applause of the nobles and made a couple dramatic bows in the direction of the Perthans before returning to his seat. Quite pleased with himself, the Perthan struggled not to laugh at the vain and silly king of Cornwall. Errol's face reddened. Worry and sorrow were replaced by anger that King Darrow would so abuse a gift given out of loyalty and love. For the first time in his life, Errol felt real anger toward his king. He was just as angry at the 24, the greatest men of Cornwall, now making Perthens of themselves and doing a poor job of it. But the greatest portion of his anger he reserved for the Perthens. In their displays of friendship, they had found a surer way to destroy Cornwall than any battle plan they had ever devised. Their enmity had always galvanized Cornwall, as pressures under the earth shape and squeeze rough carbon into diamonds. So the constant threat of the Perthens' tyranny had crystallized the Cornwalders' love of freedom into a hard and brilliant thing. But as impervious as the Cornwalders had been to outside pressures, they seemed to have no defense against the flattery of false friendship. Every diamond has its flaw, and as Errol watched his comrades in arms, even the High King of Cornwall, bowing and nodding to their old enemies, he realized how craftily the Perthens had wheedled themselves into position to crack Cornwall wide open. When Darrow had taken his seat, one of the Perthens rose to make a speech on behalf of his countrymen. To the Cornwalders' surprise, it wasn't the ranking member of the Perthen delegation who rose, but a junior member seated 4 places down on Darrow's left. He was a smirking fellow, not much older than Brennus. King Darrow, Cornwalder friends, he began. We thank you for your hospitality. We have found the evening to be most entertaining. Like you, we have great hopes that our alliance will prove useful. Decades of fighting have been as futile for Perth as they have been for Cornwall. We look forward to many happy years of friendship and mutual benefit. The noblemen and their sons clapped their agreement. The Perthen continued. And as a proof of our friendship and regard, I am pleased to announce that the Perthen Senate has voted to cement our alliance even further. They have voted to annex Cornwall as a member state of the Perthen Empire. He smiled an oily smile as the statement settled over the great hall. The Cornwalders stared at the Perthen diplomat, their brows knitted in confusion. They had heard this sort of language from the Perthens before. 4 other times the Perthen Senate had voted to annex the island of Cornwall, and each time the Perthen army had launched an invasion of Cornwall to enforce the Senate's vote. Errol sat up a little straighter. Maybe the Perthens would press their advantage too far. Maybe the old familiar talk of annexation would rouse the warlike spirits of the complacent noblemen and their king. Our previous offers to admit Cornwall into the empire have met with unfortunate hostility on your part, continued the Perthen. But we are encouraged by the spirit of cooperation that has been expressed here tonight. A buzz rose in the room as the Cornwalders began to whisper among themselves. The speaker raised his voice to be heard. And well, you should cooperate. The 24 noblemen of Cornwall will continue to hold the lands they now hold, as long as they comply with the empire and its agents. The buzz began to die down. Should you Cornwall's nobility prove yourselves loyal subjects of the empire, he continued, all the rights and privileges of Perthen citizenship will be extended to you and your families. A smile of satisfaction formed on the Perthen's face. His audience was beginning to come around. allowed to keep their huge estates, offered a chance at Perthan citizenship, the noblemen of Cornwall weren't likely to cause any trouble. And without the support of the noblemen, what trouble could the commoners cause? The Perthan went on. This island, which you have called Cornwall, will henceforth be known as the eastern province of the Perthan Empire. The buzz of whispered conversations began again. Oh, and there's one more thing, he continued. In the next day or so, Perthan warships will land on the western coast of Cornwall. Or, should I say, the eastern province? The Imperial Army will set up a base on the Bonifay Plain for the defense of the Empire's interests here in the eastern province. And, of course, for the protection of provincial subjects such as yourself.